All right, thank you for joining us for our Monday Zoom and Learn. We hold these Zoom and Learns to add value to you as an agent, broker, transaction coordinator, lender every week, minus holiday weeks. My name is Tommy Dutcher. I'm the area sales manager with California Title. And we have a nice presentation and a full house for you today. I will ask that everybody hold questions until the end. We will have a question and answer. If you do have a question that pertains to something that is happening during the presentation, put it into the chat. I'll monitor the chat and we'll make sure that we get those answered for you. I would like to introduce Mary Jane Morris with Granite Escrow. She is my co-host. MJ, you want to go ahead and introduce your team and our guest speakers today?
Yes, hi everybody. So happy to have you here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Steve Strickland and Patrick from First American Natural Hazards Report, and I'm so excited to hear what they have to say. Wanted to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. First of all, let me welcome the other reps from Granite Escrow, Tracy Hasse from San Diego, who covered me last week when I ran late for an appointment and could not get back in time for the class. I heard the probate class was very good. I think Jonna Ennis is out there somewhere, but we have such a large crowd, I can't see her on this one. So I want to say hi to her. I give you guys a shout out. And Granite Escrow brought me on the team when I was getting ready to retire from 20 years of being an escrow officer and 20 years as a broker manager. They brought me on to bring some reality and some hot, fast subject answers right now when you need them. So besides all the great VIP services and free escrows and things we do with the amazing safety record that we have, you have literally have somebody with a lockbox key on the team now. So we're hoping that's a help to you. I'd also like to give a shout out to Samantha Hayes. She's the leader of the transaction coordinating group down in San Diego, hosting about 1,000 members. I've asked her to join us because this form is new enough where I haven't had to put my fingers on it as a realtor or a broker in any way. So I want to make sure tell me not at any point in the conversation. So just before I introduce these two fabulous guys, I want to lay some groundwork here. So one of the things I want to remind you guys, one of the things that we're going to be talking about through this entire class is that this is a completely new law. Just like anything else we get completely new, we don't know how it's going to come out. And the way Carr often says things are new is we have no case law on it yet, which means it hasn't even been the small claims. It hasn't, nobody's escrow hasn't failed to close over it, knock on wood, so far, but it's going to happen. So, we have just heard the angst and the trepidation of getting this right out there. So I want to knock off a couple of things. So first of all, it's a new law where there is no previous history of how we've done this. We are making it up as we go along, meaning we do our very intentions every day and we stick as close as we can to it. If you're feeling frustrated and upset right now, you're about where the rest of us are. So don't worry about that, but we have good answers. I also wanted to talk about, and I would like Sam to talk about this when we get to it appropriately, but people are feeling this is a disclosure issue, and it is, but it is also something that may need to be negotiated. If you're going to have those kinds of repairs, if you're going to have an inspection that you don't know what it's going to bring, and you are going to have an inspection now, you're going about this property at listing. So our two excellent guests that I'm thankful for their patience this morning as I get us wound up on this, have mentioned too that how the NHDs can be ordered at listing. And I was saying that are concerned about creating costs, both in NHDs and termite reports. It's very common. My entire career, agents are afraid to order for fear of costing somebody something or having to pay something themselves. So one of the things I want to knock out is when you order an NHD report, although the information is not guaranteed until it's paid for, it is available and could conceivably be canceled if necessary. So I don't want you to worry about that cost. Same as, just very briefly, I'm going to say about a termite inspection. If there isn't a termite inspection in this town who I couldn't cold call right this second and get a free inspection out of. And if you're a regular client of theirs, you should not be fearing inspection fees. So this is my broker pitch that I've made for 20 years or more to please order these things early. And then I have one more problem that I want to discuss. And this one's for my team as well, for Tracy and escrow companies. About 50% of them picked up the duties of ordering the NHD report. If you're not pre-escrowing with Granite Escrow, that report is not being ordered until you are in escrow, which means you're past the negotiation point. You have not had an opportunity to see if you're in the fire or high fire zone. And so I wanted to cover really quickly that the escrow companies who are ordering NHDs for you, unless you ask them to order them early, they're going to be ordered at escrow, and you're going to get that information when it's available. And so again, for Tracy and Jonna and Tommy and I, we do our best to stay ahead and keep you happy. And so we want to remind you that, again, this is a good opportunity to start thinking about what you want to order or what you'd like to pre-escrow with us. I have, since we pre-escrow files, in my branch alone, I have more than 30 escrow, way more than 30 escrows in pre-escrow position where we've ordered many of the things, and including difficult demands and that sort of stuff to get things ready. So hopefully you guys will take us up on the pre-escrow. Now, more comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to the pros here. While they are speaking, I'm going to post 2 links in the chat. One is the CAL FIRE link where you can register for an inspection for your property. Daryl, one of our great agents, Daryl Self, has already been experiencing this, and he's already been turned down once by CAL FIRE and redirected to who knows where. But at least he has some records that he's plugging away at it, and then he's asked and been answered and that sort of stuff. He's also had experiences on vacant land where if you ignore their letter, the fines are coming, and if it's severe enough, they will go out and remove this brush and things themselves and send you a bill. I can't see Daryl here, but I know we got quoted or had a fee come in around $100,000 on one of these to move the grant because of the size of the lots, or maybe the numbers of them. Like I said, I can't see Daryl because of the size of it. Maybe he'll mention. So I'm going to post that link so that you can, in Riverside County, you know where to order the, maybe Sam knows where to get them in. I'm also going to post, I took a CAL FIRE webinar last week, and they said more is coming. They're saying that even bark up against the house, things within 5 feet of the house are going to be a problem. I hope I'm not stealing your show, guys. I've just got to get my crowd in the right position.
I think we're going to take you on the road with us next time.
So they're saying that things within 5 feet of the house, and a couple examples they gave was bark up against the house, and another one was patio furniture under a patio cover.
Oh, wow.
And as far as to say, if you want a patio with a patio furniture, you may need to enclose that to protect it. So when we have bad termites in what looks like a perfectly good patio cover, I think it's going to be cheaper to pull some of these down as we go along than to enclose them.
Yeah, while you're on that subject there, because CAL FIRE, they're sending out letters, right? And this time of year, they always start to go out. But I got a call from a broker last week asking me if I've heard of this happening. And it was CAL FIRE sending out a letter saying that they needed to clear brush. It was a vacant land. They gave them 21 days to do it. And on day 23, they showed up and cleared it for them and then charged them with no warning.
Wow.
So
I'm familiar with that when there's a tree upending a sidewalk and that sort of thing. So we've heard of this thing of years. This one's just has a potential for being very big and being a deal killer, and we don't want that for you. So having said all those things, and with that presumption that we all don't know completely what we're doing yet, I would love to turn this over to Steve Strickland with First American who has stood by me since I moved to Temecula, has been a great rep to me. I'm very grateful to have you, Steve, and I'll let you introduce your guest. We tried to finish up about 1:20, 1:25, so we can sneak in some questions. When we go off the air, we stay on and take questions after Tommy and I do, so feel free to stay on after if you can't stay. And without further ado, Steve Strickland, First American.
Thank you so much, MJ. Wow, I really appreciate the knowledge that you were able to drop just in the last 5 minutes. I learned something new, so thank you. I appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Steven Strickland. I'm the regional manager with First American Natural Hazard Disclosures. We're excited to be here today. We've got a great event. There is a hot topic, no pun intended, going on right now, and that's Assembly Bill 38. I've even brought in my geologist to help emphasize on the importance of what we're doing to prepare for your transactions when it comes to managing them and making sure that you have everything that's needed before you even send out that. Go ahead and introduce you to the one and only Mr. Patrick McClellan. I could go on and on and on about how awesome this guy is, but I'll let him tell you a little more about himself.
Thank you, Stephen. And thanks to MJ and Tommy for that wonderful preamble. I learned a lot myself, actually. And I just got to say, your TC organization is very lucky to have such wise counsel at the top there. So what I want to do today, I want to try to answer some of those questions that MJ addressed, specifically talking about where AB 38 is applicable and what agents and sellers and buyers can expect when they deal with some of these disclosures, the home hardening and the defensible space. But I want to try this, doing it a little bit differently than I usually do my webinars, and that's because 3 or 4 weeks ago, First American NHD had a statewide conference we called the NHD Academy Campout, where we had a half dozen different experts speaking on different current topics in the NHD industry. And one of those was defensible space. And so a 35-minute video that condensed all of these issues down into very simple and a complete presentation. And I couldn't say it better myself, frankly. And so what I want to do is play that video for you. Then afterward, we'll go to a live Q&A. So let me just get going on that video. I've only, it's okay. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So if you could please, Tommy, make me a co-host.
I did that, but I think you have to accept it. So there goes again.
Okay, where do I, oh, there we go. Okay, got it, good, thanks. It disappeared on me. Give me just a second here. It did this the last time I tested it as well. Hold on, please. Quit that.
And when you go to share the screen, at the bottom of that screen, click on the box that says enable audio.
Right, the share sound. Okay, just a second. Here, nope, that's not right. Here we go. There we are. Now, here we go. Share that and expand. Forgot to share audio. Hang on. Share sound. Here we go. Let's see if this works, hopefully. Hi everyone, Patrick McClellan here, registered professional geologist. I've been licensed with the state of California now for over 35 years, formerly U.S. Geological Survey, and for 5 years in the San Leandro Fire Department as the city's first disaster preparedness director. For the last 25 years, been with First American and JCP natural hazard disclosures. Today, it's all about AB38. I want to give you a brief review about the home hardening disclosures that many of you have been dealing with for the last 5 months or so, and then introduce you to a new phase of disclosures under AB38, the vegetation management and defensible space compliance disclosures. So you're all familiar with the psychology behind AB38. You've seen it for decades here in California. I call it the earthquake model. We live in earthquake country. Older homes are more vulnerable to earthquake damage, but the government can't make you retrofit an older home to enable it to survive an earthquake. So they educate you about earthquake vulnerabilities and how to fix them. And then they mandate that the seller make disclosures to the buyer to encourage earthquake retrofitting. And the result of that 25 years ago was the Homeowner's Guide to Earthquake Safety, which is now a mandated pamphlet that a seller of a home built before 1960 has to deliver to the buyer. 1960 was when building codes changed to make homes stronger against earthquake forces. Well, if you just swap out earthquakes and swap in wildfire, you've got the psychology behind AB38. We live in wildfire country. Older homes are more vulnerable to wildfires. The government can't force retrofits, so they educate people about wildfire vulnerabilities and how to fix them, and then they mandate seller disclosures. And that's what these home hardening disclosures are all about. Well, let's begin at the beginning. What is AB38? It started out as legislation, Assembly Bill 38, and when it was approved by the state assembly and the state senate, it was passed on to the governor, who signed it and made it a statute or a law, and it was chaptered in the California Civil Code under section 1102.6F, and another part of it under section 1102.19 that I'll tell you more about a little bit later. AB 38 applies to residential construction of 1 to 4 units. It's in the same section of the Civil Code that requires the transfer disclosure statement. So in any transaction where a TDS is required, AB 38 also applies. Under certain conditions, AB 38 requires 6 different disclosures, and I'll go through each one of these separately, but just very generally, the first 2 of those disclosures are public information. So you're going to find those in most natural hazard disclosure reports. This would be the fire hazard zone determination and a notice to the buyer that I'll talk more about in just a minute. The other 4 of those disclosures are all about documentation, which is within the knowledge of the seller. So those are what we call seller's actual knowledge, and that's the concept that most agents are familiar with. The AB 38 requirements are being rolled out in phases depending on the effective date of those disclosures. The first effective date was January 1st, 2021. And this is when those home hardening disclosures became required that many of you have already had to deal with. Phase 2 of those disclosures becomes effective July 1st, 2021, just around the corner. And then 4 years down the road, another disclosure is required that I'll just briefly touch on since it's so far off into the future. Many of you are already familiar with the AB 38 home hardening disclosures because you've already been dealing with them now for several months. So I'm only going to summarize them here. But I want to start with this notice to the buyer because it contains 3 of the essential elements of AB 38. This first concept, high or very high, what does it refer to? Well, these are specific levels on the state's fire threat scale, which has been developed by the director of the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, otherwise called CAL FIRE. And these threat levels are based on the kind of vegetation in an area, whether it's forest or chaparral or grassland, the shape of the landscape. The slope has a lot to do with how quickly wildfires can spread, and other conditions as well. So fire threat levels, high or very high. And this concept called fire hazard severity zone, this doesn't refer to city or county zones that might be designated by the city or county fire department. These fire hazard severity zones are specific mapped areas defined and bounded and identified by CAL FIRE also. And these designate a specific fire threat level. So for example, you could have a high fire hazard severity zone or a very high fire hazard severity zone on a CAL FIRE map. So that's what these fire hazard severity zones refer to. I refer to them throughout my slides with this acronym FHSZ. It's one of 3 acronyms that I want you to remember. I'll talk about the other 2 a little bit later on. The other concept that I want you to know about is the Wildland Urban Interface Building Code. This is also in the notice. This refers to a chapter of the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, that was added back in 2010. Well, that's why AB38 refers to 2010, because older homes, those built before that chapter was added, didn't have the benefit of the wildfire safety requirements that are in Chapter 7A. And then at the bottom of the notice to the buyer is this web address, and I'm going to point back to this in just a few minutes here. And the home hardening disclosures, if the home was constructed before 2010, 3 disclosures became required effective January 1st, 2021. Talk about each one of these individually here. The first is a list of low-cost home hardening features. These are features of design and construction that promote wildfire safety. They include non-combustible roofing materials such as tile or metal or composition shingles, enclosed roof eaves to keep flames out from under your roof, screens on chimneys and rain gutters to keep leaves from accumulating that could be ignited by an ember and cause a fire that burns down your house, non-combustible siding, metal or stucco, double pane windows to resist the intrusion from the fire, and so forth. That list of low-cost retrofits can be downloaded from the CAL FIRE website at the web address in the notice to the buyer, or you can download it from our website under the electronic bookshelf. Now, older homes don't have many of those modern fire safety features, so they remain more vulnerable to wildfires. And under AB 38, if the seller is aware of any vulnerabilities on that list, they need to be disclosed to the buyer. The final inspection report, when a new home is completed or a remodel or renovation is completed, the building official comes out and prepares this final inspection report. It has some information in it that the buyer needs to be aware of. For example, it verifies which building code the home was constructed under. Was it before 2010 or after 2010? It establishes that the construction was done according to the plan that was approved in the building permit, and it documents compliance with certain building standards and regulations, such as those that promote wildfire safety. If the seller is in possession of that final inspection report or knows where to get it, that information also needs to be passed on to the buyer. Well, this seems like a lot of information for the seller to collect and organize for these disclosures, but as many of you know, CAR came to the rescue with its Form HHDA, the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. It made things pretty simple. It has a place for the seller to indicate the year of construction. Was it before or after 2010, for example? It includes this notice to the buyer in bold text. It includes the list of these home vulnerabilities, wildfire vulnerabilities, with a checkbox for each one of them where the seller can indicate awareness of any of those vulnerabilities, and a place at the bottom of the form to indicate the seller's awareness or possession of this final inspection report. This next disclosure is important because it's so timely. Its effective date is just around the corner, July 1st, 2021. It's about vegetation management, and specifically, it's about proving that your property is in compliance with state laws and local ordinances that require defensible space around structures. In short, AB38 has made this proof of compliance with defensible space a mandatory disclosure. And I'm going to get back to this in more detail toward the end of the webinar. But first, let me just check off this last one. Phase 3 of AB38 is about wildfire retrofits. It takes effect 4 years from now, but it's an issue that sellers often ask questions about. And that is, does AB38 mean that I've got to retrofit my home before I can sell it? Well, I'm not a lawyer, but my reading of AB38 doesn't indicate anything that requires a seller retrofit the home for wildfire safety. It does say this, and I'll read this. The notice shall disclose which listed retrofits, if any, have been completed during the time that the seller has owned the property. Doesn't say anything about the seller having to do any of those retrofits. If the seller has done any of them, then those retrofits need to be disclosed. So a frequent question is, how do I know if I'm in a fire zone where these new disclosures are required? Well, it all comes down to the language in AB38. For example, high or very high fire hazard severity zones identified on maps drawn by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. In another section, it says, the seller of any real property subject to this article that is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone as identified by the Director of California's Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And it repeats that. So several times within AB38, it specifies fire hazard severity zones on maps that are drawn by the state's fire service agency, which is CAL FIRE. So that's where AB38 disclosures apply. Now, this is a good place to review these fire hazard severity zones for you. California is divided into 3 categories of fire protection responsibility. Our national parks and national forests are under the federal responsibility, where the U.S. Forest Service is the lead fire protection agency. AB38 doesn't apply there to that federal responsibility area, but there are 2 other areas, the state responsibility area and the local responsibility area, where AB38 does apply. And here's where I get to those other 2 abbreviations that I mentioned, SRA and LRA. SRA is the state responsibility area. This is where CAL FIRE has fire protection responsibility. And LRA is local responsibility, where a city or county fire department has the financial responsibility of responding to wildfires. And the map on the bottom is just a diagram to show the relationship between an SRA and an LRA. LRA is surrounded by this dashed line, SRA surrounded by the solid line. And you've been making an SRA disclosure for years. It's on the natural hazard disclosure statement at the front of your NHD report. You've been disclosing whether the property is in or not in the state responsibility area. But this says nothing about the fire threat levels within the SRA. A lot of people don't realize that the SRA is subdivided into 3 different fire threat levels. There is a moderate fire hazard severity zone, a high fire hazard severity zone, and a very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA. And under AB 38, if the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone in the SRA, then these AB 38 disclosures apply. Now, CAL FIRE also recommends fire hazard severity zones to local responsibility areas, but it only recommends one fire threat level, and that is the very high fire hazard severity zone. It doesn't recommend a high or a moderate zone within the local responsibility area. So in summary, AB 38 applies if the property is within a high or very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA or the LRA. So how do you know if your property is within one of these areas where the AB 38 disclosures apply? Well, you can find part of the answer on the statutory NHD statement at the front of your NHD report. It includes two different fire zone disclosures. The first is the local responsibility area disclosure. If that checkbox is marked yes, it means that you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone that's identified by CAL FIRE, and the AB 38 disclosures apply. If the second disclosure, which is the SRA disclosure, is marked yes, it means that the AB 38 disclosures may apply, but you just can't be quite sure about that. And that's because the SRA includes a moderate fire hazard severity zone that is not specified under AB 38. Now, the California Association of Realtors suggests that if you're in the SRA and the Wildland disclosure is marked yes, that you can probably assume that you're in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone and that the AB 38 disclosures apply. However, they add that you may be over disclosing because of these moderate fire hazard severity zones also in the SRA. So we checked, we looked at the amount of area in California that is within the moderate fire hazard severity zones of the SRA. It turned out to be pretty significant. A little bit more than 1/4 of the area of the SRA is in a moderate fire hazard severity zone. And these areas include some pretty important real estate markets in California. For example, in the North San Francisco Bay Area, in the Placer and Sacramento County areas, rapidly developing, and along the Central Coast. So there's a lot of real estate in these moderate SRA fire hazard severity zones where you may be over disclosing. So what can you do about that? Well, you can use a reputable NHD provider that includes explicit determinations of whether you're in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone within the SRA. And you'll typically find those disclosures in this report down in a section that's referred to as additional statutory disclosures. In this case here, you can see the fire hazard severity zone for AB 38 is distinguished in this disclosure, not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. At this point, I want to update you on a rapidly developing story. You may not be in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone right now, but that may change. The reason is that after the 2017 wine country fires in Sonoma and Napa counties and the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, it became pretty clear to most everybody that CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zones didn't do a very good job of anticipating where a wind-driven wildfire could spread. And so CAL FIRE went back to the drawing board to retool its fire threat mapping technology and produce a new generation of fire hazard severity zone maps that was intended for release prior to the implementation of AB 38 last January. Well, along comes COVID, along comes last summer's record-setting wildfire disasters in California, and those maps got delayed. And so toward the end of last year, CAL FIRE said those maps should be released sometime in the spring of 2021. Well, here it is at the end of the spring of 2021, still no new fire hazard severity zone maps. We just got an update a few weeks ago letting us know that these new maps would go into review by local agencies probably during the summer and be released late this summer or early in the fall. So those new maps will identify not just where wildfires can start, but where they can spread to under the influence of 60 or 70-mile-an-hour winds. And that means that these fire hazard severity zones will be much larger than they are currently. So if you're not in a fire hazard severity zone now, you may be when these new maps are released later this year. Let's get back to phase 2 of AB38, defensible space compliance. This is not in the same section as the home hardening disclosures, but in a different section, 1102.19. And it's the hottest disclosure out there right now because its timeline is immediate. Its effective date is July 1st. 2021. Now, AB38 doesn't use this term defensible space in describing this new disclosure. It uses the term vegetation management, but the bottom line is the same thing. The goal is to create a defensible space around your home that protects the structure from flames and burning embers and protects the firefighters who come to defend your home during a wildfire. It's a buffer. This defensible space buffer is 100 feet wide away from the house, with a smaller buffer inside it 30 feet away from the house, in which the vegetation is more intensely managed and maintained. In that inner buffer, tree limbs have to be removed from overhanging the roof. Dead and dying tree limbs have to be cut back 10 feet from the chimney. Brush has to be trimmed away from the windows in the home, and other kinds of vegetation management within that 30-foot zone. Outside of that zone, annual grasses have to be kept below 4 inches in height, and tree limbs have to be cut away up to a certain height that prevents flames from jumping from the grass on the ground up to the treetops, laddering up the tree. So this is your defensible space zone. Laws have been in place for decades that require defensible space in high and very high fire hazard severity zones, but they just haven't been really aggressively enforced until recently. And AB38 makes proof of compliance with these defensible space laws a required disclosure in home sales in high and very high fire hazard severity zones, or where local ordinances require proof of defensible space compliance. So how do you document compliance with a defensible space law? Through a defensible space inspection. And this is typically provided by your local fire authority. It could be your city fire department or a county fire protection district, or even CAL FIRE if you're in the SRA. What they'll do is come on your property, they'll compare your vegetation conditions with what the law requires, checking the boxes as they go. And when they're done, they'll deliver to you an inspection report, and that becomes your proof of compliance. On the right is an example of one of these inspection reports. It's what CAL FIRE uses, and it'll give you an idea of what to anticipate if you have an inspection on your property. And I'll leave a link to this form in the takeaway at the end of the webinar for you. Sometimes the first inspection is free. Sometimes the fire department will charge a fee for that first inspection, but all re-inspections typically are at a cost. So it's good to pass the inspection the first time to minimize the cost of that service. Now, an important point about the defensible space disclosure is that unlike the home hardening disclosures, which apply to homes built before 2010, the defensible space disclosures are not limited to homes of a certain age. They apply to homes of any age, regardless of the year built. And the reason for that is, of course, vegetation doesn't have an expiration date. It just keeps growing, and it needs to be continually managed and maintained. Where does the defensible space disclosure apply? Well, in the same places that the home hardening disclosures apply, in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone identified by CAL FIRE in the SRA or in the LRA. But wait, there's more, and that is that cities and counties can be more restrictive than state law. A city or a county may regulate defensible space more strictly than CAL FIRE, and property owners must comply with those local laws. So for example, a city may enact a local ordinance that requires vegetation management everywhere in its jurisdiction. And sellers and buyers, just like any other citizen or resident of that city, must comply with that local ordinance. So seller and buyer must comply with local ordinances, whether in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone or not. And if a local vegetation management ordinance requires proof of compliance, then that proof of compliance becomes a required disclosure under AB 38. So just as CAR came to the rescue with the home hardening disclosures, it's done the same thing with the defensible space disclosures. This old HHDA form that you've been using will go away on July 1st and be replaced by a new form, the FHDS form, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory Disclosure and Addendum. It will replace the HHDA because everything that was on the HHDA is also on this new form. You see it at the top of the page circled in red. And then the disclosures for the defensible space compliance, those will be at the bottom of this new FHDS form. So CAR is making it as easy as possible for seller and buyer to navigate the complexities of AB 38 when it comes to documenting compliance with these defensible space and vegetation management laws and ordinances. Okay, so let's wrap this up. AB 38's defensible space disclosure is required in any high or very high fire hazard severity zone as identified by CAL FIRE, or where a local vegetation management ordinance requires defensible space compliance. So it comes down to a key question. Does my community require defensible space compliance? And how do I know? I'm going to explain this with a little bit of a civics lesson. And the only reason I know is because I spent 5 years in city government. We all know how a state law is made. The legislature proposes a new law, a bill, and both houses of the legislature, the Senate and the Assembly, vote and approve and pass it on to the governor, who then signs it, and it becomes a new law or statute that's chaptered in the state code. Well, it's the same process at the local level, but instead of the legislature, we have commissions. So for example, the Planning Commission will say, we need a new ordinance to regulate hazardous vegetation on private property. Fire department, please provide us with a draft ordinance that we can consider. So the Planning Commission holds an open meeting, takes public comment, revises the draft ordinance as needed, and passes it on to the jurisdiction's governing board. At the county level, that's the Board of Supervisors. At the city level, it's the City Council. And they vote to adopt the ordinance. It becomes a local law that then is chaptered in the municipal code. Now, at every level of government in that process, there's an officer who keeps records on those new laws and ordinances. At the state level, it's the Secretary of State. At the county and city level, it's the county clerk and city clerk. And they have all these ordinances right at their fingertips. Sometimes the municipal code is available right on the city or county website. And for some cities, there's even an online ordinance database that you could very quickly look up vegetation management or defensible space. So if I'm an agent, I call up the city clerk and ask, does my city have a vegetation management ordinance? Clerk says, why, yes, the city council just passed it last week. Well, please send me a copy of that ordinance or send me the link where I can download it from your website so that I can share it with my real estate sellers and buyers. And boom, you're now the local real estate expert on AB38's defensible space disclosure. And when you get that ordinance, be sure to read it and verify whether it includes a point of sale requirement. In other words, does the ordinance require the property owner to obtain documentation that the property complies with a defensible space regulation before the property can be sold? That can really complicate a transaction. So you want to get that proof of compliance as early as possible if that's the case. So now your seller or buyer is ready to schedule that defensible space inspection if the ordinance requires it. But who do they call? Typically, it's the local fire authority, but really, who is that? And don't dial 911 to find out. AB38 is not an emergency. But in a real emergency, if you dial 911, who's going to roll up on your curb? Well, it's typically going to be a fire truck with firefighters and paramedics to assess and stabilize whatever the situation happens to be. Well, what name will be on the door of that fire truck? That is your local fire authority. It could be the city or county fire department or the county fire protection district or a regional district of CAL FIRE. Sometimes it's an inspector from the local building department, but that's kind of rare. But the point is, seller and buyer are going to be looking at the agent as the expert in local real estate to know who that local fire authority is. So if you don't already know, you probably should find out before July 1st. Okay, so finally, AB38 is not the most clearly written law in California history. CAR has done its best to translate and simplify AB38 with its form HHDA and the new one, the FHDS. But it's a complicated law. If you want a legal interpretation of AB38 or reliable legal advice about any law, don't ask your NHD provider. Ask a legal expert, an attorney who can represent your interests. And that's why at the bottom of every slide that you've seen here in my webinar, there's this red disclaimer, consult your corporate counsel. I want to finish up with just some best practices for AB38. First, use a reputable NHD provider that does these things. Many providers don't. Use a report that includes the AB38 disclosure, a report that explicitly discloses CAL FIRE's high or very high fire hazard severity zones in the SRA, a report that relies on CAL FIRE's current official fire hazard severity zone maps, and a report that tells you specifically which maps were used to make those fire zone disclosures with. Second, call the city clerk or the county clerk to investigate whether a vegetation management ordinance exists in your territory where you do business. Third, obtain the proof of compliance early with regard to the defensible space requirements. A lot of people don't realize that a defensible space inspection has two possible outcomes. You can pass, here's your proof of compliance, proceed with your transaction, or you can fail. Here's a list of your violations. Now you've got 30 days within which to fix them. So if you fail, you can get out there and quickly clean up the property, do a lot of tree trimming and landscaping, or you can hire a contractor to do it for you. That gets expensive. We've heard cases of up to tens of thousands of dollars cleaning up a property for a defensible space inspection. And then you've got to schedule a re-inspection by the fire authority to come out and pass that one so that you can get that proof of compliance. And if you can't afford that, then the city or county can come in and do it for you and bill you for the services. If you can't pay that bill, they'll put a lien on your property. And nobody wants those costs and delays and red flags showing up on their transaction during the escrow period. It can delay closing. It can allow the buyer to rescind the offer or give the buyer an opportunity to negotiate the price downward. So if the ordinance requires it, get that proof of compliance early. So thanks for attending my webinar. I want to leave you with a takeaway of some useful AB38 resources. It will include a copy of the AB38 law, the actual text as it's chaptered in the state code, CAL FIRE's list of low-cost wildfire retrofits, and CAL FIRE's notice of defensible space inspection, the blank form, so that you can anticipate what a defensible space inspection might include in your area. And then a recommendation to check out CAR's new FHDS form, which translates and simplifies the AB38 requirements, as well as the accompanying defensible space and fire insurance quick guides from CAR. And then also ask your First American or JCP sales representative to explain the AB38 disclosures in the First American and JCP report. And finally, tune in to NHD Academy on the web to see our educational videos. There's 9 of them that cover California's natural hazard disclosures. And we'll see you later.
Right, that was outstanding. Thank you, Patrick. That was.
Well, thank you. And I want to just do one more thing. I want to open it up to some live QA. But before I do that, I want to just sort of tell you what the most common questions are that we get asked. And so let me go ahead and just start this up here. So the 3 most commonly asked questions are, where does AB38 apply? I think I've made that pretty clear here. And second, who do I call to schedule the inspection? And then what's wrong with that phone number that you gave me? So let me just really quickly get into that. AB38, of course, as I've tried to point out, applies in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So those are 2 different zones. It's not all high, but it's high and a very high fire hazard severity zone as identified by CAL FIRE, or where a city or county has enacted a local vegetation management ordinance. Now, an AOR like CAR is free to advise its members to use a CAR form in a local fire zone, not just in the state zones, or to advise CAR members to use the form in a moderate fire hazard zone, or to err on the side of caution. We've heard that phrase before, or where using the form is the safest presumption, and those are CAR's words, that the disclosures apply. An NHD provider can't err on the side of anything. You don't want a report that has errors in it. So we have to make our disclosures not based on any presumption that they apply, but make our disclosures based on where the law specifies. So the next question, who are you going to call to obtain that inspection? That's been a major question that's still hanging out there. And we have a new feature in our report to help you answer that question. We have directly investigated nearly every fire department, fire district, and fire agency of other kind in California, 475 cities and counties across the state that are served by a total of 350 state and local fire agencies. And we've compiled a database of local fire inspection contacts. And we focused on the jurisdictions that have a high or very high fire hazard severity zone identified by CAL FIRE. And we just didn't pick numbers off the web. We actually asked the fire officials what number they want homeowners to contact them at to schedule an AB38 defensible space inspection. So we think we've developed the most comprehensive database or directory of AB38 fire inspection resources for you. And you'll find those contacts in our report in the AB38 disclosure section. There's a new advisory at the bottom of that section that has a little table that contains that local fire inspection contact information. And recently we've heard a few concerns, I suppose, when people dial the phone number that we provide. They say, well, it didn't give me the service that I expected. What's wrong with that phone number? Well, what's wrong is that the California fire culture hasn't caught up with AB38 yet. We started this inquiry 3 months ago, and at that point, there were many fire agencies that hadn't even heard about AB38. Many agencies are volunteer fire department where they only answer the phones a few times a week. So in those areas, you have to leave voicemail. And some agencies, I'm not going to say they blew it off, but they delayed planning for the onslaught of inspection requests that they were going to receive come July 1st. And so many of them did not have an operational plan for responding to these inspection requests until just a week before July 1st. And some of them, even after July 1st, were still trying to develop the resources and phone contacts. And the good example of that is the Los Angeles County Fire Department. Many of you may not realize that in LA County, there are 88 city jurisdictions, incorporated city jurisdictions. LA County Fire has the responsibility for 2/3 of those cities in LA County. And LA County is the poster child for a delayed response to the AB38 inspection challenge. We started asking them 2 months ago, do you have a phone number that we could tell our customers about? They said, no, not at this time, we'll get back to you. And every couple of weeks we called and got the same answer until the week after July 1st. We called and they said, no, we still don't have a phone number, but here's an email address. So what you'll find in our report for those 60 some cities in LA County is an email address that you can send your inspection request to. So that's just an example of how much more work has to be done by the fire agencies to really catch up and begin performing at their peak level to the AB38 requirements. We can only tell you what the local fire authority told us to tell you. We don't second guess local fire officials. We don't decide any of their policies or procedures. We don't assign them their telephone numbers. We don't train their staff how to handle public inquiries, for example, and we don't manage or maintain that public record. We simply report it. So you may see some situations where the information, the contact information in our report may not be accurate, but the bottom line is, we believe that giving our customers the best available contact information in their search for an AB38 inspection is far better than having our customers spend their valuable time needlessly searching for it. And we think we got a really valuable resource for you, and we're proud to be the only NHD company to provide it. And so with that, if there are some live questions, I'm happy to give that a shot.
I need to jump in here. We are definitely running over now, but it's an important subject for those of us who can't stay with us. We will piece together the recording, including the inserted piece that Patrick taught for 35 minutes. We'll get that all pieced together for you sometime today, certainly by tomorrow.
Okay.
Patrick and Steven, I'd love if you'd stay with us if you can. I hope you don't have to go. I need to jump in and get Sam in here for the risk management portion of it for the real estate agents. So just like Patrick said, I'm already getting these calls where they want me to be the person who tells them which agency. And I fear that both for myself, my escrow officer, my agents, I'm concerned about that. That is a big problem. And one of the things that Carr said endlessly during their class was the one thing it couldn't protect us from was how many local ordinances and things are you going to bump into? And the most restrictive one has to be done. So you may get all the way through with A and then have to satisfy B. So we've got that problem. What I directly want to spend a couple minutes on with Sam is there's also an option on that form to check a box send it over and say that the buyer will complete this inspection within 1 year after close. And I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of temptation to use that if it's not already being used already. It doesn't circumvent this system clearly. So I would love if you could talk in your practice about whether this is a disclosure or a negotiation that has to happen, and then what's going on with that form out there? What kind of questions and things are you?
Well, I think the thing we all need to notice and pay attention is the top of the form lists that it is a disclosure, advisory, or addendum. And what that means is it can be used in all facets. What I'm seeing recommended from the other trainings I've been on is this really should be included on any transaction for a property that's prior to 2010, 1 to 4 units, not TDS exempt. Because this is part of the same civil code as the TDS, that means the same timeframes and extensions in RPA 10, where it's an additional 5 days and it gives the opportunity for a buyer to cancel if not provided within the time frame. You've got an issue. As we all know, we live in a fire state. Those of us who lived in Southern California, I still remember, I think it was 2010, where they were evacuating from the 52 to the 76. Now, are these currently in high fire? No, but we know what last summer happened, and we know what's already warming up, that this fire season has started early this year. For those of us, because we, unlike with the natural hazards, we can go on the on the side of risk management, caution, and overabundance. It is recommended, there's nothing going to harm to give the information to a client. And there's nothing going to harm by providing the document. You can mark the box, I believe it's section 3, states that the property is not in a high fire based off the NHD information provided. However, the seller has decided to voluntarily provide this as an advisory. That's why it's got the 3 different titles and the names up at the top. The practice I'm seeing is a lot of people don't understand that this needs to be included with your offers. I think we're going to see in a few years, there's going to be lawsuits and court issues where buyers come back, and as we've all talked about, some of these bills and the clearings costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, that they weren't disclosed or told this information. So what I've been doing, talking to the different brokers, and of course always verify with the broker of record of the file you are working on, is that I see no harm in including this form. I think it's very beneficial to include. I think it definitely, you've got to pay attention to where you're selling the property. Downtown, because I work mainly in San Diego, but downtown San Diego versus East County, into Santee, everywhere else, into Temecula, Marietta, Lake Elsinore, we've got very different types of situations and exposures. So you really need to be aware of what property you're selling and have a conversation with your clients. Get them the information. Us being the contact for CAL FIRE and who should they contact, I completely agree. It's kind of like Megan's Law. Agents are not supposed to be going on that. We cannot become experts in that. What we can do is direct people to the CAL FIRE website. The seller needs to do their own investigations and find out what is required for their property.
It's been, I have been saying, unfortunately, it is a tiny seller research project. We can order the NAD, we can do this, that, or the other, but, and what if I choose CAL FIRE and I get lucky and they come out, but it's really Temecula City that needs to, and Temecula's one or the other, more or less, and I did the recommendation. It's and again, no case law, no small claims.
Not yet. I mean, and certainly you just triggered me to remember the RLA, so the listing agreement was changed as of July 1.
Right.
The seller now agrees to have the NHD ordered with the listing agreement. So I know not everybody does the open file situation that you do for getting prepped ahead of time, but anybody who's working on files, if you have a listing, I always highly recommend you give that to your TC as soon as possible, get the disclosures done early. Get that NHD ordered. Let's find out what's going on, if there's any red flags. That's going to help you negotiate so that you can throw that in to a counter if the buyer side didn't, and you can put that on the buyer side, or you know what you're negotiating for costs. It's going to make you a better agent, and it's going to help you take care of your client.
I can't think of the paragraph right now, and I know you'll pop right up with it, but the paragraphs that we all try to avoid that are kind of general in the purchase contract and the costs that say whether government retrofits would be a seller or a buyer cost down the road. Lots of people had been pulling those out for years because there wasn't something this big, but buyers are going to have to, especially in a competitive market right now, trying to take as much off your contract as you possibly can. To put in a random, maybe you're going to have to pay for something, is something this listing agent's going to need to be ready to answer, in my opinion, at contract. However, in 20 years of brokering, saying you should order your NHD and your termite report up front, I never cracked 25% because we all know people are exhausted. It takes 3 hours to get them to let you meet them, and then another 3 hours to get through the listing form, and another 3 hours to get through the TDS and all that. So unfortunately, not everybody goes back and orders everything perfectly the way they, just like we've been trying to get TDSs and SPQs all this year. I did have a specific question for you, Sam. The TDS for residential 1 to 4, does that eliminate vacant land then, as being that it's not TD? Now, see, I'm saying you're still gonna want to have that inspection and make sure you don't have $100,000 worth of.
I don't think they've reached that yet. I think it's a very, very valid question. It officially, I'll give you the official answer. I'll give you my opinion answer. So 2 things. 1, where to find what you were just talking about on the contract, top of page 3, section 7, because I'm a nerd. 2, regarding the vacant land and everything else, currently it is specifically properties prior to 2010, TDS, 1 to 4, not TDS exempt. Is it going to harm anybody to attach that and take a look around? No. Do I think they haven't reached that yet and we're going to end up with court cases that are going to mandate it? Yes. And we've got
people pulling entire contingencies, 100%, no contingency whatsoever, and get hit with this. So yes, they have the right to trigger the rescission, just like you would on a TDS, but are they getting their deposit back? I've got 2 of those sitting on my desk right now where people are like, help me prove that we should get our deposit back. And Carr also this year asked us all to stop practicing law that way, meaning guessing how it's going to come out. Anyway, you do have to have some understanding of it. And Carr does acknowledge that our jobs all do have a limited scope of practicing law. But, we try to keep that down as much as possible. So I want to open it up for other questions now, but I wanted to get into the form and the negotiation and being prepared to put this to bed. So if the buyer's going to take responsibility for it, and that's what you intend in this market, because it's a seller's market, and you want the buyer to have this problem down the road, please remember what Sam said, without any case law or anything, we have no idea what the seller's going to do when he gets a bill. I mean, when that new buyer finally gets around to it and gets that bill. So it's, we're all going to be learning together. I would love to hear from everybody as you're having your situations. I'm always open for discussions about these kinds of things. But we had such a good presentation. I definitely want to give you guys a chance. So I want to throw it open for questions now. Tommy, do we have questions, or does anybody would like to ask Sam or Steve or Patrick a question? Tommy, you're muted, honey. Tommy, you are muted. Tom.
All right, so there was one for Steven. Does your NHD report disclose if there are local ordinances for AB38?
Well, and I put down, we provide the contact number in our reports for the seller to find that out, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be the seller to make that phone call. It shouldn't be the agent, but this will give you the information to direct to the seller. But again, make sure that you're ordering the NHD at the time of listing, just so you can be better prepared for that.
Stephen, can I just also add to that? We looked into the possibility of a database of local jurisdictions, cities and counties that had vegetation management ordinances. And because they're changing all the time, it's impossible to maintain a current database. And even Carr promised to do that for its members as long ago as a month or two. And we've never seen anything since then. So I think even Carr kind of gave up on
They retracted that promise.
Yeah.
Well, you're among friends. Many of the leaders that you see in this group right here are people who build that kind of history and know what they're doing and know people they can tap on. Unfortunately, I could hear immediately that my answer was not complete or perfect or comprehensive enough. And so I have to issue a warning every time about it. So from the agent's perspective, with that information, hopefully you'll be able to do better negotiations have your inspections. And certainly, just like I said at the beginning, we're all going to get to the point where this is routine. It's just not remotely now. And without case law, we don't have now. Just to give CAR a shout out, not only did they prepare that form for us, but remember, if you use that, the most common version of that form, and their language fails in the case law, they will pay the judgment. So it's very important to be using your CAR form, your most current CAR form. Just 2-3 years ago, they had 3 cases all at once come up about their language and something else, and they won all 3 cases. So the CAR form is guaranteed, very useful if you're using the current version of the form.
There was another question that says, when representing the seller, if we check 4B3, does that put the responsibility for compliance onto the buyer to deal with after close of escrow?
If they agree with it, if you use, Sam's going to say something.
Okay, no, you go ahead.
No, you can't just shoot somebody a bill, through a disclosure. So yeah, I think that's what's going to happen. I think it's happening right now. I think that's what's going to happen. But like I said, even if they accept it to close because of the current market, or they don't understand or whatever, when Cal Fire's walking all over the property, they're going to remember who you are very easily.
Well, and if you look, I included, if you scroll all the way up in the chat, there is a copy of the form for everybody for reference. And when I looked at that section real quick, what that's stating is that the seller wasn't required, but did obtain the report and will provide it within 7 days. Now that's going to open you up for negotiation depending on what the report says. Mm-hmm. If you have, as Patrick and everybody was pointing out, if you have a report that says, hey, we got to come back out, there's stuff to be done. Now you got an issue, because are you transferring a cleared title, clear everything property, or is the buyer assuming that responsibility? So that's on you as the agent. And this is why this is so important, and why the verbiage is in there, to make this an addendum to the contract so that this can be clarified.
Yeah, I think if you're relying just on the form to transfer liability, bottom line is the seller pulled the form, or the agent pulled the form, which means you guys are aware of it, which means if you didn't put in your disclosures and disclose of it, then liability is still going to fall on you in most cases. So, it's a catch-22, but you're gonna want to stay close to it and disclose of it. And then if they accept it, then it falls on them.
And get it all in writing that they accepted it, do an addendum, and make sure it's belt and suspenders, and no assumptions.
Right.
Putting on my broker hat, I think I'm going to lean on the E&O companies as well. They have quite a bit of riders you can get, whether you want to be a property manager or not, whether you want to be a notary or not, whether you want to handle business ops or not. I'm going to mention that we need a hardening rider or something too. So I won't get that right away, and there's so many out there, but when you're renewing your E&O, that's a good question for your E&O.
That was the last question that I saw in the chat.
I sure appreciate both of you. I'm sure Steve's got his information in the chat by now. I don't know how I would get through these events without Tommy and Sam and Tracy and Jonna and our great speakers. We will continue to bring you the best of the information as we have it. We'll have sometimes. We did lose the recording about midway, so Tommy's going to see what he can do about a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to get the presentation recording from Patrick and Steven, and then I'll cut it into the Zoom for that portion, just so that we didn't miss anything. I lost internet halfway through, so I apologize for that. And we'll get it posted. It'll be posted by, sometime late afternoon tomorrow.
And then I'm gonna let Tommy take us off the recording, and then thank you all for attending. Next week is Jane Brogan from CRMLS coming to teach about the RPR reports top to bottom this time. And so we'll hope to see you here about that. But then I want to remind you, and hopefully that we do stay on as you guys click off. So if you want to stay on and talk about a particular situation.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. We look forward to
We
seeing
would
you.
love to book
Thank you
Steve.
for having us. We do appreciate it. And we look forward to servicing all of you.
And let me just say thanks to Sam and Tommy and MJ for those comments were just wonderful to hear. I really was informed by them.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you. And I hope that those of you out there who would need a presentation will be reaching out to Steve for your office, because like all of us who teach, it can be done one at a time. It can be done in a room full. It can be done by Zoom, however we need to do it to get you guys settled.
Yeah. All right, guys, thank you again. If you guys want to stay on and ask specific questions, we will remain on and get those answered for you. Thanks again.
It looks like